thank you for making time today to we have a very special presentation from Science for Peace. We have Dr. Emily Gilbert presenting on a very important topic in a time of climate crisis. She'll be presenting on militarism and climate change. The format today will be just this brief introduction, Dr. Gilbert presenting, and then a couple of questions from the moderators, and we'll take a few more audience questions. Before we begin, just a quick introduction of Dr. Gilbert. Emily Gilbert is a professor at the University of Toronto, cross-appointed between the Canadian Studies Program and the Department of Geography and Planning. Her research focuses on securitization and militarization with respect to borders, the economy, and climate change. She's published numerous articles on the topic, and she's also an editor at Security Dialogue and the vice principal of University College. Dr. Gilbert, thank you for making time for tonight and looking very forward to your talk. To the rest of the audience, please stay muted until the question and answer period. And if you have any questions as Dr. Gilbert speaking or afterwards, please feel free to type them into the chat as well. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction. It's great to see some familiar names and faces out there in the void. So I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides to present. And so I'm working from my office, which I haven't done this from so often. So let me just... There. So can you all see that full screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thanks so much. So I can't see the chat right now, but we'll catch up with the chat afterwards if there are any questions. So as Ali mentioned in the introduction, my focus is really on security. So I'm deeply interested in issues to do with the environment and climate change, which I think are pressing issues, but I come at this as a scholar of security and the military. And so you'll get a sense of that from my presentation. And I hope to learn from you all about some of the aspects around climate change and even securitization and militarization that I may have overlooked or not be as familiar with. So I have, I hope, about 30 minutes to present, and then hopefully we'll have a great conversation afterwards. So I'll just run through my slides. So as a geographer, this is very common in our field that we present a lot of images and PowerPoint slides, but hopefully keeps you focused on things as we move along. So just to begin, militaries are a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. There's been a recent study listed at the bottom of the screen here by the Conflict and Environment Observatory and Scientists for Global Responsibility that just came out a few weeks ago, indicating that by their calculations, militaries around the world are the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And that is that they're responsible for about 5.5% overall. Now, the big problem here is that governments are not required to report the amount of greenhouse gases that they emit. Some do so voluntarily. The Paris Agreement from 2015 encourage states to do so, but many don't. So it's really hard to get this calculation. So the report is very helpful and it goes through the math that they've used to get to this number. It's maybe not entirely accurate. They don't actually count warfare as part of this. It's mostly about operations. So there's still big gaps in the kinds of ways that we're making these calculations, but people are starting to try and account for the great amount of greenhouse gas emissions that militaries contribute. Netta C. Crawford has recently published a book on the image on the right, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, that goes into more detail on the US, what the Pentagon is emitting. And as she and others have said, that as an institution, the US military is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. It's responsible for about 80 to 90% of federal government emissions in the United States. And as the world's largest military, bigger than the next 10 militaries combined, it is indeed very responsible. So all of this is to say that militaries have a huge role to play in thinking about greenhouse gases and contribution to climate change. And if you look at any of their vehicles, you could understand why this may be the case, just looking at the miles per gallon that they get, whether it's a Stryker vehicle or an HMMWV or a US Marine MRAP, the mine resistant ambush protected vehicles. So you can see they're not very good in terms of the miles per gallon. And of course, if we look at some of the aircraft, or if we were to look at ships, I can only give some examples here, but you can see there's obviously, just in terms of the amount of oil that they use, a huge amount in terms of this kind of equipment that the military is using. And then we can also look at the impact of war and how that also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is an older study that was looking particularly at the role of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions during the early stages of the Iraq War. So these calculations are from March 2003 to December 2007. And Stephen Kretzmann from Oil Change International estimated that at that time, just in that less than 4-year period, the US military operations were ranked, if they were ranked as a country in terms of emissions, they would be emitting more CO2 each year than 139 of the world's nations do annually. So it's not just the normal operations that we need to account for, but also warfare, which is also hard to put a number value on, but people are trying to do so to draw attention to these very issues. And if we look at forward operating bases, oil is a huge part of how the military operates, whether it's the United States, if it's Canada and Afghanistan, or other countries on the ground. In fact, back in 2011, US General David Petraeus said energy is the lifeblood of our warfighting capabilities. And so really it is seen to be crucial to the ways that military do their business. And yet at the same time, even as Petraeus was making such a comment, it was also clear to many that oil was also a real problem for the military because of the ways these convoys, as you can see here in the picture on the left, could very easily be targeted for attack. So trying to get your oil to these forward operating bases not only was difficult because you had to cross borders or you had to transport the oil internationally, but then the long convoys such as these that were conveying oil were also very easy targets on the field. And so it has also been said by other generals, like the US Marine Corps General Jim Mattis, before he was in charge of defense under Trump, that we needed to unleash from the tether of fuel. That was his words about the US military, because of the kinds of attacks that were happening on these oil convoys. So in terms of their own military operations, for their own military objectives, it was becoming clear to the US military that something had to change in terms of the need for oil that they had on the ground. It has also become clear to militaries such as the United States, and many of these examples will come from the US. Again, it's the largest military in the world by far. But the US has also been coming to terms with how climate change is impacting on its bases and operations within the United States. So climate change related events like Hurricane Michael were responsible for this catastrophic damage at the Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama, Florida. So that's on the Panhandle in Florida. So you can see some of the impact there. So the military is very aware that these bases, many of which are on the seas, have been very vulnerable to climate change impacts, and even inland as well. So this is an image from Nebraska where we have the Offutt Air Base being flooded out. About a third of it was underwater because of the overflow from a river, again attributed to climate change. So this kind of impact at home has also really started to impact on the military's thinking around its need to address aspects to do with climate change. And of course, there's also the ways that climate change has been seen to be responsible, if only one of many factors, for conflict that's happening around the world. So even back in 2007, we had Ban Ki-moon stating that one of the contributing factors for the conflict in Darfur was to do with ecological crisis, arising in part from climate change. One of the problems here is that it's very difficult to identify climate change as a single kind of factor that leads to civil unrest or other kinds of conflict, but many people are absolutely identifying the role that climate change has in contributing or even being the instigating factor around the kinds of challenges that we find in many parts of the world for reasons to do with reduction in access to resources, needs, for farming or for water and so on. And so this relationship between conflict and climate change has also become much more accepted. Here's another example of a map here where Ewald Wiseman, who's an academic and an architect based in the UK, but has his roots in Israel, has been tracing some of the correlations between climate change and the impact on the ground. So Naomi Klein has also picked up on this in some of her work. And looking at the way as this map shows that the locations of many of the Western drone attacks in Northern Africa and the Middle East also coincide with the aridity line. And as that aridity line has shifted because of climate change and many more places are in drought, we see civil conflict arising, but also US and Western intervention in precisely those places. So the point is that this is not a coincidence that these things are happening in hand with one another. And bringing it closer to home, we also see the way that this is contributing to changing understandings of the Arctic. So I could go into this in much greater detail, and maybe we can in the discussion, but there are lots of territorial claims in the Arctic, and there are also conflicts around those territorial claims, including between Canada and the United States, Canada and Russia and other countries as well. So Russia in particular has been really reorienting its military to its Arctic region. Canada did so as well under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. That's faded a little bit, but we still have every year summer operations like Operation Nanook that go into the Canadian Arctic to reassert our sovereignty in that region. And part of the reason for that are the changes to do with climate change because of the impact it's having on increased access for boats. So you can have more tourism, and there have been tourist boats that have gone up there. There's been more access for around the year trade through the Northwest Passage, for example. There's also been potential for more oil exploration in the Arctic region, which has led to more military buildup, most particularly in Russia. So here's an example of Russia's Trefoil Air Base, which is its most northerly military base, which actually dates back to the 1950s. But back then it was just a radar station with a small runway. It's now been upgraded in the last couple of years with a couple more runways. You can see from the images here, these runways are capable of carrying some of the largest planes and other military vehicles. And they now have a 24/7 presence in the Arctic and have really shifted a lot of their attention to protecting their own northern passageway, which they claim as their own sovereign territory or maritime waters, as does Canada with the Northwest Passage. And notably, the United States disagrees with both countries that we have territorial sovereignty over those areas. So there's a lot of potential for conflict to erupt in these regions. We have NATO operations happening in the region in light of this, which could also increase tension. So there's a lot of ways that climate change is leading to different kinds of potential conflict scenarios like this in the Arctic, as well as the ways that militaries in places such as Canada are retooling so they can do more kind of humanitarian style response when there are climate change impacts at home. So this is just a mild example here of Canadian soldiers trying to push back some of the waters on the overflowing Ottawa River, but another example of how the military sees itself as responding both internationally and domestically to some of the changes that are unfolding as a result of climate change. It's therefore not surprising, I think now knowing all of this, that militaries are turning to look at climate change more explicitly. And I first came across this when I was living for a year in Australia, and just as we were getting close to coming back to Canada, but I was very interested when Kevin Rudd, who is then Prime Minister, announced this event here. As you can see, the release of a defense white paper in which climate change was identified as a security threat. And for me, that was the first time that I had heard that link being made, and I had heard that link being made by a military. And I was particularly interested in this case because they had a special interest in what they saw as the potential for climate refugees coming from the South Pacific and potentially coming to Australia because those islands were becoming inundated with water. So that was one of the big focuses of this defense white paper. They were also interested in changes to fishing grounds in the region in Australia and the potential for conflict there. But this for me was the first time that I came across this kind of linkage that was, the military's taking this kind of interest. And when I came back to Canada and started to look into this a bit more, and this is where my interest in this started to form, I found out that Canada too was making those kinds of connections. So in January of 2009, we had a national defense report that was identifying the environment as a future site of security concerns. The following year, the Pentagon released its own quadrennial defense review, and it was the first time that they identified climate change as a military threat. And they even posited then that energy efficiency would be a force multiplier. So already back in 2010, the Pentagon was thinking about being more energy efficient as a way of being better on the battlefield, which is something that I'll pick up a bit more as we go. And then in February of that year as well, the UK Ministry of Defense also issued its own climate change strategy. Now, there had been some previous kinds of statements and there was some recognition about climate change, but I think this was really the constellation in the years 2009, 2010 that these things really started to come together. And since then, it has only increased in terms of how militaries around the world are taking up these kinds of issues. So in September of last year, the Department of Defense issued its own climate adaptation plan. And as they stay in the forward of this document, around the world, climate change is a destabilizing force, demanding new missions of us and altering the operational environment. At the same time, climate-related extreme weather affects military readiness and drains our resources. So really making a clear statement as to both the future of potential conflict, but also the impact on military operations as well. So that fulsome dynamic is being identified here. And then if we look even more recently to this year, to February, we have the United States Army issuing its climate strategy. Now, none of these documents are really full of grades of research or information, but they certainly do contain some nuggets around their climate strategy. So the 3 goals that they set out to proactively consider the security implications of climate change with respect to strategy, planning, acquisition, supply chain, and programming documents and processes, and also their other goals of achieving 50% reduction in Army net greenhouse gases by 2030 compared to 2005 levels, and then attaining net zero Army greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And those 2 last measures have been taken up by other militaries as well. So this seems to be the challenge that militaries have on the table, about 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So they do have some tangible goals that they have set, even though these documents are quite short on detail. So this Army climate strategy document is only about 20 pages, and it's a very quick read because there's not a lot of content there. You would not go to these documents to really get a clear sense of the changes that are anticipated. But there are ways that the military has taken up this challenge and is trying to innovate. As I mentioned, oil for forward operating bases is seen as a big problem for the military because of the threat it puts them under. So we do have innovations like this one with solar panels being implemented, in this case in Helmand province in Afghanistan, as a way to try and reduce the demand of the soldiers on the ground for the need for oil, or even for batteries is another issue because of the amount of equipment that soldiers carry these days is so reliant on having some kind of energy source that that's also seen as a threat and a challenge to the soldiers who are operating in the field. There's other kinds of more cool kinds of technologies that are being innovated and trialed in the field. So these kinds of tents that have portable, flexible, and lightweight solar-powered shades are really becoming quite the norm, whether they're in kind of more green landscapes on the left or desert landscapes like they're in Djibouti in Africa, which is the only African state that the US has a military base. And this is one where they have these solar-powered panels that they are using to try and reduce their need for oil and other horrible energy sources that they're using. These are examples of some of the new kinds of ways that they're trying to design the soldier themselves to be more energy efficient. So solar powered helmets, like you can see on the right, other kinds of ways that they might use the textiles themselves to be energy generators. They have these kinetic energy harvesting things you can see on the left that look a little bit like a leg brace, but this would be a soldier on patrol that would generate their own energy while they were in the field and thus reduce the reliance either on oil or battery power. So all of these solar harvesting backpacks that they've designed. So they're really trying to think through these different technologies to reduce the amount of oil that they have and other energy sources. And this is another example here of a solar-powered water purification system. And so I use this example here because there are ways that some of the technologies that the military is innovating could have longer-term and better use on the ground. So this is an installation that potentially could be permanent, but could be left in the community that would have a longer-term impact and not only be for military use when it's there. So there are some ways that they're thinking creatively about some of these kinds of innovations. I will come back with some caveats about that in a few minutes, but it is important to see the kind of the breadth of technologies that are being innovated, and including the installation of solar power at many bases across the United States. So this is just one example at the Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. There's over a dozen, I believe now, Air Force bases with these kinds of extensive solar powered fields. And partly it's because military bases have very extensive land that they have open to them where they can put some installations like this into place. Obama was very much in support of this kind of retooling of the bases, part of his green initiatives that he touted, maybe less effectively than we would like, but he did have the rhetoric anyway about having kind of more green machine in the United States, including ways that he was trying to bring vets who had been involved in the war on terror into the green economy. So he even had a project that he was channeling people who had been in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular and bringing them back to the US and training them up so that they could be part of this new green economy that he was proposing. But these kinds of innovations have also taken on different kinds of shifts. So this is the first floating solar array that is now in place in Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which is the US military's largest base in the United States, perhaps even the largest populated military base in the world. So here they're innovating with some water, or these floating solar panels on the water, again, trying to reduce their domestic use within the United States in terms of their reliance. So this idea of energy independence and energy efficiency has very much pushed some of these kinds of initiatives that the military has taken up, including the ways that they are powering their vehicles. So this is the GE F-14 Green Hornet, which is now powered by 50% biofuel, which they're deriving from all kinds of different sources, including pond scum, grass clippings, old t-shirts, and they're seeing this as a way, again, to reduce the reliance on conventional oil. Or they've also looked to electrify their vehicles. So these are non-operational vehicles. They realize that this is probably impractical in the field of battle to need to plug in your tank, but they have turned their fleet in the United States over to these electric vehicles, and it probably is one of the largest electric vehicle powered fleets within the United States. So they are using this new technology and contributing to some of the research and development on this kind of technology. And as we can see from this quote that I've included here by Oshkosh Defense, which is one of the biggest military companies within or it's not maybe the top of the companies, but it's one of the key ones in the United States. Not Oshkosh that makes the overalls, but it's a different company. They create vehicles such as these. And as they are very proud to say that the silent drive that these electrical vehicles mean that they won't, the enemy won't hear them coming. I mean, this is a little bit of a farcical statement because they are not using them in battle operations, but it just shows how they're trying to think through the implementation of these kinds of new sources of energy for these vehicles. But this brings me to some of my concerns. And so as much as I think, if the militaries are going to be such big, they are in fact such big contributors to greenhouse gases, it's really important that they start to address that. I have real problems with some of the ways that the military is really inserting itself in the space around climate change, innovation, and the importance that they are putting onto climate change. And I'm going to now talk about some of those concerns. One of them is the military is really trying to position itself, especially in the United States, as a key player in climate change innovation. And that means that they are the ones who want to be seen as the drivers for new kinds of technologies and new developments in terms of thinking about more, better vehicles, as this quote is showing here. So electronic vehicles, working with leading contractors like the GM's defense unit, but also the way that the military becomes the funnel through which that funding is allocated. So that industrial military pipeline is being reinforced by the military's turn to climate change. And I feel that that's a really troubling aspect of what's going on, particularly in the United States. So the military is using this to actually up their budget, which in the United States is already unbelievable at over $780 billion a year annually. But using this kind of innovation, this kind of partnership with private companies as a rationale for increasing the amount of money that goes to the Department of Defense. And I think that that's a real problem with what's going on here. There are ways that they are inserting themselves in the research and development, both in terms of the private sector, but also angling into universities, and that research and development, I think, is a real problem. And this is just one example of how that is taking place. It's a problem not only because it actually reinforces the role of the military in the United States, but it also drives the kind of technologies that will be developed. So this emphasis on kind of private vehicles that the military would use, SUV style vehicles, means that that's where the research and development money is going to go, not on things like public transit, because obviously the military has no interest in public transit whatsoever, or thinking around those kinds of things that we might need, but thinking about their own kinds of toys that they need on the field, and then potentially the ways that those could be taken up in the civilian domain. So I think all of this is actually really worrying. As much as I think, the militaries need to reduce their greenhouse gases, I think this kind of partnership with industry, with the private sector, with the universities is really, really troubling. And in fact is really just kind of papering over or glossing over some of the structural problems, which are to do with the kinds of ways that we have designed our societies around capitalism and around consumption, right? And so this kind of way of thinking about innovation through private sector is really just glossing over some of the structural problems. And in fact, as I said before, reinforcing the role of military within society. This extends to the ways that some of their environmental initiatives are also always imagined in terms of their capacity for killing. So this is an example of how the military shifted over to copper bullets away from lead bullets, which is less about climate change, but it speaks to my point about how their interest in thinking more environmentally, so moving away from lead and to copper, is still structured through their own interest in being a killing machine. So that's what the military is all about, and that's what they want to do better. So it's only because copper, even though it's a lighter substance, can be turned into a bullet that is as effectively lethal as lead, that the military is interested in this kind of environmental innovation and design. And so again, we have to keep that in mind as we're looking to what the military is doing and being very mindful of the fact that that is their bottom line. They are interested in being a war machine and a killing machine. And that is a big problem if those are the kinds of people who are directing some of the changes that we need to have happen with respect to climate change. And in fact, this is stated very clearly in the Army's climate strategy, where they say upfront that the Army's core purpose remains unchanged. It's to deploy, fight, and win the nation's wars by providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance as part of the joint force. Climate change will only make this mission more challenging, and the Army must proactively reduce the risk that climate change imposes. And here too, that this idea that climate change is going to only exacerbate the kinds of conflict that we see in the future, which it may well do, but this idea only further legitimates the need for a military that is able to respond as much as it is also trying to be proactive to try and think about reducing its own greenhouse gas emissions. It also reinforces an idea, which I think is very prevalent, that all crises like the ones that are brought about by climate change lead to conflict. And I agree that conflict is one possible scenario, but it overlooks the ways that crisis can also lead to cooperation and collaboration. And in fact, we've seen this during the pandemic, which was a crisis, that we see as many examples of terrible things happening. We also see lots of people offering fulsome support to one another, working collaboratively, thinking about one another. And unfortunately, the military inserting itself in this space encourages an idea about conflict, about people fighting, rather than thinking about how crisis might be used and harnessed, in fact, to think more about collaboration and cooperation. The military also is very much about security and not being very transparent about what it's doing. And I think that's a really difficult model to adopt in thinking about climate change, which again relies on cooperation with countries around the world and across the public and private sector. So this kind of model of secrecy, of not allowing people in, of black boxing, whether it's research and development or the kinds of technologies that they are innovating, I think is also deeply troubling because of the ways that the military is stepping in to this space. There's also the concern that militaries are all about hierarchy and about discipline, and they're not about bottom-up solutions. They're about being told what to do by your superiors and enacting those kinds of commands. And I think, again, as a model for addressing climate change, this is deeply troubling as militaries, again, really try and insert themselves into the climate change discussions and really trying to take some control over the direction that these conversations unfold. And so I'm bringing us close to the end here. I just have a few more slides, but that talk about, the problems around military greenwashing, but bring it up a little bit into the present. So my main takeaway right now is, yes, militaries do need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but in doing so, they're actually reinforcing their own, their perceived need on the ground, and in fact, redirecting more resources to the military, which I don't think is part of the solution that we need to be looking towards as we move forward. And so just a few comments about some recent COP meetings. So back in Glasgow last year, the COP26 meetings, it was the first time that the NATO representative was there taking the floor. That's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who you can see on the top right there, who also attended, although virtually, at the COP27 in Egypt. But this was an important moment where NATO was stepping in and saying, okay, we have a role to play in thinking about climate change. And indeed, this year in the summer, they also put out their own climate change and security impact assessment, which has some goals very similar to the US military's goals. So they too are taking up these issues around climate change, as saying that they really need to address these issues. In this case with NATO, even though they're thinking about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, they very much are emphasizing climate change as a crisis multiplier. So this idea of crisis, of ongoing crisis, future crisis, more resources for militaries, more resources for NATO is very much part of the framework that they are projecting. We also have other advisory councils on climate change, which bring together military and former military with other researchers and so on. Now, I don't think that these are necessarily horrible organizations. I think there's probably some good that can come of them, just as I think that there's some good that can come of the military's reducing greenhouse gases. But I do think the rising number of these kinds of advisory groups that really do foreground the military, perhaps the International Military Council on Climate and Security foremost, I think are, again, really problematic in the proliferation of militaries in thinking about these kinds of issues. And again, the emphasis that is placed on crisis and conflict, and hence on the need for the military. And in Canada, for those of us are watching from Canada, we, I think, need to be very mindful, because in June of this year, the Madrid conference, the NATO Madrid conference, we had Trudeau on the stage announcing that there will be a new climate change and security center for excellence, and it will be located in Montreal. And this center, again, may well do some great work. I don't doubt it. I think all of these things are complicated. There's good and bad that come out of them. I think that this is maybe a good initiative. We'll see. It's very early days, but it's very clear from the get-go that the intent of this center is to be a platform for military actors and civilians to develop, enhance, and share knowledge on climate change security impacts. So again, the military is very much a central actor in terms of thinking about how this will unfold. Given the military importance in terms of the kinds of money that are going to the military these days, I am a little concerned that the militaries are such a key part of these kinds of conversations, and that the discussions and the initiatives will be railroaded to their agenda. Now, having said all of this very critical stuff, I think, about what's going on, I should also note that since the time when I first started looking into these things back in 2008 and 2009, that there has been a lot more activism that is making the links between militarism and climate change. And so those are just a few examples of some different campaigns that are underway. You can see the brochures that are there, but also the people in the street carrying signs that are making these very explicit connections between the ways that militaries are contributing to climate crisis and the need for militaries to decarbonize. And in fact, and this is my last slide, we had at COP27 Code Pink making this argument. In their case, they were very specifically looking at militaries reporting on the emissions that they are generating, because that is one small step to draw attention to this, but also to push militaries to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. So I'm not saying that this was necessarily hugely impactful. I don't know that any resolution has come out of COP27, but I do think it's really important that these kinds of links are being made, that there are these activists who are taking up the call to make the links between militaries and climate change, and to argue both for decarbonization and demilitarization. So it's not about making militaries more resilient and better able to adapt to climate change, but it's looking at a way of addressing climate change by de-emphasizing militaries and reducing their power. And I think that's really where we need to go, is not buttressing militaries by allowing them to take up the agenda that is kind of greenwashed and seen to be more humanitarian by turning to address climate issues, but actually working towards decarbonization and demilitarization hand in hand. So I will leave it at that. I've taken a little bit more time than I thought I would, but I hope there's still plenty of time for discussion and conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Dr. Gilbert. I do want to mention that moderating today as well, we have Dr. Richard Sandbrook with us for Aiden. Olivia, she unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. So before we get to the audience overall questions, Dr. Sandbrook and I will just have a brief conversation with Dr. Gilbert, and then we'll take some more audience questions. Jot it down if you like, put it into chat, and we'll get to you at the end. So with that, Dr. Sandbrook, do you have any questions for Dr. Gilbert?
Well, I don't know. really where to start, quite frankly. That was really a remarkably thorough overview of the issue of militarization and climate change. There's so many aspects to it that I found compelling. So I guess what I would like to do is just summarize what I think are the negative consequences of the military taking up climate change in the way they have, and then lead on to a question. So for me, I think as I jotted them down here, there are really 5 issues for me. First of all, the skewing of priorities in research and development, which is inevitable when the military plays a major role in innovating in green technologies. Second of all, the effect of militarization of climate change is that the focus is on the consequences of climate change as created by this nebulous external threat, which is climate change or the environmental decline. So it's seen as this nebulous kind of thing. Its causes are not investigated, the consequences of it and how the consequences can be counteracted in order to advance the national security of individual states is what is really focused upon. Thirdly, the military focuses on conflict, not cooperation. It's a matter of competition among the United States and Russia and China, but also involving other powers as well, like the UK and Canada, with respect to the Arctic in particular, focusing on conflict and dealing with its own attempts to promote national security. But as a result, the cooperation at the global level, which is absolutely essential for climate change, is pushed to the side. That's a very unfortunate situation. The fourth thing is the top-down nature, as you mentioned, of the military approach to climate change, a command structure from the top down, whereas any kind of real attempt to deal with the climate question will necessarily involve communities organizing, probably at the local level through the municipalities, to actually understand the causes of climate change and move against those causes. And finally, and probably perhaps even most importantly, the role of the militaries in green technology, as you say, or as you implied, increases the legitimacy of the military and also their access to resources, which not only builds up the military as an institution within society, but also deprives other institutions of the resources needed to deal with climate change. So overall, I mean, I accept what you say as the points I mentioned. I'm sure there are other ones as well, but those the ones that I focused on as being real consequences and very dangerous consequences. And then, of course, for an organization like Science for Peace, the question is always, well, what do we do about it? You know, where do we start? And then, of course, we're up against a situation of usual situation of a small organization scattered in a peace movement across countries, within a country and across countries, facing an opponent that not only has enormous budgets in its own PR departments and so on, but also supported by a whole range of foundations who indirectly support the military-industrial complex, and as well the carbon economy as such, indirectly, if not directly, through market mechanisms, such as the Fraser Institute in Canada, the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK, the American Enterprise Institute in the United States, all of which have budgets. The minimum budget would be that of Canada's Fraser Institute, which is $27 million. And that of the British Institute of Economic Affairs is £37 million, and that of the American Enterprise Institute is much higher. I got $100 million just over in revenue a year or two ago. How do we organize to make a difference in that context? It seems overwhelmingly difficult to do, especially in a context where we as organizations are involved, individually in sort of a competitive way in dealing with these issues. It is a question to which I search for an answer always, and we try and build coalitions as best we can. We have very little impact in civil society on military policy. We have all kinds of issues and demonstrations along, whether it's fighter jets or spending more money on the naval vessels, or on various wars going on in the world, but we may have very little impact. So for me, the issue is, what do you do in the face of this context? This is the military face of climate change, is really part of a existing order that has to change dramatically in order for there to be any change on the climate front. The kind of, I'm sorry to take up so much time, but I mean, I think this talk has been really far-reaching, and I really wanted to express my admiration of the depth of the analysis, but to go beyond that, to think, we have to find ways for organizations with tiny budgets, dependent on volunteers, to deal with the overwhelming budgets of not only the military, but of the supporting institutions in society in order to bring about the change. And we're not doing a very good job at this point. So I hope somebody has an idea for how we can do it better. So I don't really have a question as such, but rather an overwhelming desire for some direction of how we can deal with this part of the overall problem of systemic change required to achieve climate stability in the near future. So thank you very much.
Maybe I can sort of frame what Richard was saying as a question, because that was actually very similar to what I was going to ask. Given the prevalence of the military-industrial complex and the pervasiveness of the type of thinking that has throughout the power structures in our societies, do we need civilizational transformative change to achieve demilitarization, from your perspective?
Yeah, these are great points to which I do not have a single answer, but I would say, like, my sense is that all change happens, and this is terrible because I'm going to now use a military metaphor, in terms of the tactics that you use that are short-term strategies, like the short-term ways that you're going to address something, and then the long-term strategy, right? So yes, systemic change is what we long-term need to flip everything that we're doing. But we also have to operate in the here and now, and that's where the tactics are really necessary, and they work hand in hand. And yes, I find the crises that we are facing now, both with respect to climate change and the military, overwhelming and depressing for those reasons. But think of how much worse things would be if we did absolutely nothing. And so that's what we need to do, even if we're doing the smallest of things, is that things would be much, much worse if nobody cared and nobody did anything. So that's not a practical solution as to what to do, but I think organizations such as yours probably also have already lots of things in your toolkit around what to do. I mean, I don't think petitions in and of themselves necessarily solve these problems, but they keep up the pressure. So again, if we didn't have any petitions, people would get away with doing what they're doing and much, much worse. There's also attending, these events, and I have colleagues who have gone to COP27, as well as many of the other meetings, and have been voices of protest and activism on the ground. I do think that all of those things matter, but I don't think any one of those things is going to lead to big structural change. And we have to face up to that and just still get on with it and still do the things that we can do in the interim. So that's less a solution, but more of a kind of a philosophy around how we need to approach things rather than what we actually can do. And I think you probably all here have many better ideas on the things that we could be doing.
So on that point, there's a question Aiden had shared that is perhaps relevant to, okay, we're in this reality. And so I'm going to read her question, and I might combine both of her questions into one. So to frame an issue like climate change security is to imbue it with a sense of urgency that could compel governments to take concrete steps required to deal with the problem. Could the recognition within militaries of the security risks of climate serve as a positive step towards slowing? And on that point, many generals have spoken about the strain on resources associated with responding to climate-related events. You had sort of presented how the Canadian military has played a role. I know in the United States, the US Army Corps of Engineers has been building levees. Can we perhaps use those voices to transition from these military entities to more civilian institutions that are taking these roles? And could that be part of that demilitarization? So we engage positively with these institutions.
I mean, I think that's possible. To speak to the latter point first. On the other hand, I say if we need organizations to address those kinds of needs, why don't we create something else that's not the military? Like, why do we turn to the military as the solution to that problem? And this is where using that security language becomes problematic if that lends itself to a militarized solution. So I agree, and I do think that there have been some very well-intentioned, well-meaning reasons for securitizing the discourse around climate change and other kinds of things. And I do think that it comes out of a place to draw people's attention. And I think that that's really necessary. Like, we have to make people understand that it is a crisis, but it's a crisis that the military is not there to solve and should not be responsible for solving. So if we use the language of crisis, we have to be very clear that it's a language of a kind of a human crisis that does not require a military response. Because militaries, at the end of the day, no matter how much they retool to be peacekeepers, as we've had that legacy in Canada, bogus as it is, but it's been there. There has been that dynamic to the Canadian military. They have taken on humanitarian kinds of jobs, both at home and abroad. At the end of the day, as the military documents themselves say, our job is to defend and to kill. And if that's going to be their bottom line, I don't think no matter how many rivers they help stop flood, they are still there to kill and defend. And that should not be the organization that we turn to address climate change. That's not to say that they couldn't be helpful here and there. Of course they can be. But if we find that we need an organization that will handle humanitarian response vis-a-vis climate change, let's build that organization. Let's turn away from the military, reinvest those resources elsewhere, rather than still bolstering up militaries.
I guess just on that point, and I want to follow through a little bit more. In many instances, aside from civilian groups, the military seems to have a realistic understanding of what is coming from climate. Not necessarily in terms of framing it in terms of conflict, but like some of the more existential risks that are coming. Whereas our government institutions seem to be in denial about that and not listening to the civil society about that. Is there a point of convergence and interest to push that forward? I know the military is planning to live in a 4-degree world. The UK military is doing this. So, I mean, they might be doing it on, okay, well, our civilian leaders aren't listening to us. But what do you think is this disconnect with our civilian leaders? I know it's sort of a bit out of the scope of what you were talking about, but I'm always curious. I don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I will say that even when the military is on board with climate change, as they have become more so in the United States, they even now have a general in charge of climate change within the US military, and who went to COP27. Even when they were vocal about this, when Trump was president, he didn't listen. So there's also the way that even if the military isn't advocating for it, it doesn't mean that it's going to get traction either. So that's, again, not necessarily the solution. It's not quite answering your question around what to do with civilian leaders, but it's to say that, again, here, just because the military is taking up doesn't mean that it necessarily resonates if you have a government in power or a president in the US who's not going to listen anyway.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that the military does not have to deal with the whole question of the causes of climate change, of the kind of privileged structure of the world in total, and also within societies itself, and how inequality relates to climate change. But governments do. So civilian governments have to deal with the issue of how you go about dealing with climate change, and that involves conflicts with industry and with very powerful groups in our society. So the military, in talking about environment as a threat, and external threat that has to be dealt with. We have to, within the national frame of reference, is wholly detrimental to what we're trying to achieve by dealing with the climate crisis. It's all very well to develop these tents that are run by solar panels and to be concerned about your energy independence and therefore build that. That's not what we're dealing with climate change. It's to do with power structures and how they are to be framed. So what we need to do is to be able to frame the issue in a way that it is clear and compelling, and try and push that issue as best we can. And of course, I do agree very much that demilitarization and decarbonization should be very much together, and that is really what makes what is the prime focus of Science for Peace right now.
So, well, we have a lively discussion in the chat, and some of those questions are pertinent to the conversation. So I might start bringing in some of those, if that's all right. Yeah, okay. So
please, I've been trying to look at them and it's impossible to keep up with. It's great, I love it. It's like back to teaching online again.
Well, I think this sort of builds on Richard's point right now. So this question comes from Linda and Alan Slavin. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you know how much more Canada spends on military compared to climate mitigation and health?
I don't have the figure, but Tamara Lawrence has looked at that. And I believe if you just Google her name, some of her PowerPoint slides do come up where she tracks in Canada the investment around the military and the environment. And you can see by the way she tracks it, I don't have the actual numbers to hand, but the environment has totally been flatlined in terms of our investment in Canada over the last 20 or so years, and military spending has increased. And very few people, I think, know that Trudeau has increased the military budget by 70% since he's been elected. And I think he's committed about $65 billion more to the military in Canada over the next 20 years. I mean, I don't think he's actually put the money in as much as he said he was going to, probably thanks to COVID, but that this was part of his platform, in part in response to Trump and some of the pressure Trump was putting on Canada. But we have increased our military spending already quite significantly, certainly not by 70% already, but that's the target for 20 years that Trudeau had announced a few years, by I think 2017, he made that announcement, whereas there's not been the same kind of investment in health, maybe health because of COVID, but that was not part of his plan, but certainly not in environmental issues.
Okay, thank you. And I think that goes back to that question about just the framing of our civil, how we see society, right? The military often presents itself as a guarantor of trade, global security, right? Our dominance is what allows supply chains to occur, what allows us to get energy security. And so without challenging those fundamental assumptions, it might be a higher priority to spend on, you can make a case that it's a higher priority to spend on military to maintain that economic engine going in lieu of health and these trade-offs. So we need to come up with challenges to that argument and alternative systems that don't perhaps rely on global supply chains or this energy. Because as we see with Europe in the Ukraine crisis, the energy crisis is a big issue there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Then I will move to reading a comment from Dr. Judith Deutsch. She said, wars military also destroy carbon sinks and militarize and securitize borders, preventing tens of millions of people from crossing borders. There is the fallacious monetization of using military spending in comparison with domestic spending. How do you monetize life itself? So that sort of echoes the previous question, and you had mentioned with the Australian refugees. And I think over the past several years, we saw the development of concentration camps in the United States with the Central American refugees, and we see Europe outsourcing to Libya and Turkey, blocking refugees coming from Turkey, from Africa. So do you see that accelerating in the next decade? The increasing role, at this point, it's been military cooperation with the Mexican and Guatemalan militaries, for example, and the police being used for the actions on these borders. But where do you see that growing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that is in many of the military documents that I've looked at, the potential for climate refugees is absolutely identified as one of the key threats that they envision And I think that's, again, hugely problematic, that if we're going to respond to people in crisis who are losing their housing, their livelihoods, the places that, you know, they have traditionally lived because of climate change, and our response is going to be to use the military to keep them back, I think that's horrific. And that is, I think, only going to increase because that's, in fact, what the militaries are designing themselves to do. And they see that as a key part of their plan for protecting the nation states that they are, you know, affiliated with. And again, I think that's one of the challenges around this militarization, is that it is a very, you know, defensive attitude. And Richard picked this up. It's about protecting us and keeping other people at bay. And that defensiveness includes people who are undergoing the threats of climate change, usually not because of the, you know, the contributions that they've made to greenhouse gases, but because of the things that we've done in the global north are now on their back door.
Thanks. I'm going to jump to another question that perhaps builds on this. Actually, no, it's the next one. So Jody Berlin wrote, thank you, great talk. My question is about the emphasis on greenhouse gases versus minerals required for electronic vehicles. You mentioned copper, there's also lithium involving major mining initiatives in South America and elsewhere. These mines involve massive appropriation of indigenous lands, which also involve security forces and increasing interest in mining off-worlds, militarization of space. How can we expand greening initiatives to encompass these problems?
Yeah, hi, Jody. And these are great points. I mean, these issues around other minerals are not the ones that are picked up as clearly in some of the military documents. Those are not the focus that they emphasize. I don't think that they're not aware of them, because absolutely they need a lot of those minerals for all the high tech that the soldiers carry with them, the equipment has, the internet access that is now prevalent in terms of the battlefield. All the things that, you know, run our cell phones are also all the things that the military soldiers now need on the fields. So they're absolutely aware of those things, but that's not what they kind of prioritize in their own documents. But that is something that we could draw attention to, particularly because, as you're indicating, those kinds of access to resources are often the places where militaries step in to try and secure that access because of their corporate interests that they're protecting or their own kinds of needs. So that's another crucial thing that I think could be drawn attention to. Yeah.
Okay. A couple of other points just reinforcing the threat perspective and how that affects climate thinking. Another point about, does Canada actually have an independent military foreign policy, or do we just follow the lead of the United States? Is there a space for us to stake out an independent policy?
Yeah, I do think we have an independent policy, but it's one that's always with an eye to the US. For sure. I mean, we are definitely, we keep in line with their agenda. But there are some differences. There have been differences that have been more clear over time. The history of peacekeeping, which I said was bogus. I mean, there was some elements of peacekeeping. I think we've mythologized it more than it actually was peacekeeping. But that was a tradition that was different than what the US was engaging in, and we've retained some of that. So I also think that the degree of militarization in our culture is certainly not as pronounced as is in the US and in certain parts of the US in particular. So that's a difference. That's not about our foreign policy, but that's around the dynamic, and even the kind of value that we attribute to the military, I think, is different in Canada. But yeah, I don't think we can ever have a policy that is not keeping an eye on what's going on in the US and even with our other NATO allies. And this is one of the challenges with a globalized world, is we also have to be mindful of the people who we are, you know, doing our different exercises with and training with and so on. And our ability, or the ability of any of those countries to diverge significantly is probably quite slim, unfortunately.
So there's an interesting question from David Last. about perhaps collaborating with military institutions. So he says he hears the concern about militarization, but didn't hear any suggestions about using the military momentum to further peace and climate change. Frankly, military organizations are doing more and better than peace groups. Even if we look at low performers like Canada, Finland, or Portugal, military networks for cooperation are far more extensive and effective than those of the peace community. And in some countries David works with, they are much closer to peace groups than they are in Canada. Have you tried engaging with military educators beyond insisting they shut up and go home? And he would be happy to engage with you as he teaches a course with young military engineers. And he shared his email as well.
Okay, great. And I just on that note, I mean, I would love to see the questions in the chat later if they're being recorded, just because I can't keep up with them as I'm trying to engage. Yeah, you know, I have not tried to engage with the military on this particular aspect of the work that I've done. I've had conversations about other things that I've looked at, you know, and I do think I agree that there are probably ways that they are doing better around some of these issues. They have taken reducing their greenhouse gases to heart, and I think they will be able to accomplish that precisely because of the more kind of authoritarian structure that they operate under, that it makes it easier for them if they have an idea to operationalize it. But that's, again, not to say that I would like that as a model for us to imitate in terms of our wider engagement with these kinds of issues. Just like in the United States, I think the private sector has been to the far better innovators around some of these climate change issues. Does not mean that I want to emphasize the role of the private sector in the world either. Like, I do think we can recognize some of the successes that have happened without necessarily wanting to center the military or even the private sector in terms of the kinds of solutions as we move forward. So I'm not against the militaries taking up these kinds of issues. I do think that we need to push back as they try and take charge over some of the ways that we are thinking about what needs to be done, because as a model, I do not think the military provides the solutions. That's not to say that individuals within the military, people who work with the military, or other kinds of military actors are not doing a good job. I absolutely am open to that kind of discussion, but I think as a structure, as an institution, it is not the way I would like to go in terms of addressing these kinds of issues, or even the way that I would like to restructure our society in terms of centering further the military in terms of how we understand the way we're going to deal with future crises.
There is a related question from, although I guess more of a comment, from Tom Delagianis on this topic as well. He writes that he's a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change and a member of the Research Project Working Group with NATO on Climate Security. But he's also a member of Science for Peace's board and committed to demilitarization. He says these are not incompatible directions or allegiances. There are many people within these organizations who take climate change seriously and want to mitigate their climate impact. We should welcome these efforts, he thinks, and if they lead to real reductions in the next 30 years. The fear of securitization from environmental or climate change has been around since the 1990s, and it's not a serious issue in his view, given the scale of other military and violent conflicts, threats that unfortunately provide more than enough rationale for military budgets. We need to build the mechanisms and organizations to foster peaceful solutions to international problems. That's a bigger priority. Do you have a reaction to that comment?
Yeah, I mean, especially to the first part, like, I'm all for people being in complicated relationships to the many organizations and institutions that they work with. Nothing is a perfect institution. And so we are always involved in all kinds of ways with organizations that we don't agree with 100%, or we feel are doing some good work, but maybe not everything. And so to be involved in organizations that are working with the military, but also working for demilitarization, is the complexity in which we live in today. And I think we have to come to terms with that and embrace it and do the best we can do in all of these different venues. So I'm all for that. And still being able to step back and say, in an ideal world, this is not maybe the way that I would want to think how we want to deal with what we're facing right now, right? And so keeping, again, that kind of that longer term what is the model of society that we want to move towards, which is one that is, we don't have climate change, or we've mitigated the impact of climate change. And we are also not so reliant on militaries. For me, those would be like great outcomes of all of this. In the meantime, we have to work together and think about how we're going to strategize and deal with the institutions that we already have. So I think, that sounds to me very practical, but also like just keeping those things in tension all the time is really important as we move forward.
There's some follow-ups that I would also, Tom or David, if you're willing to just give a brief response, because you are involved in those organizations. I don't want the conversation derailed, but I'm curious. So someone in the audience Colin Stewart brought up degrowth. The idea of degrowth has gained a lot of traction in civil society as a real solution to climate change, getting us off this infinite growth economic engine. Similarly, decolonization and respecting Indigenous rights have also gained traction in civil society. Do you see room for those, and do you hear those conversations and support for those concepts in the military circles that you're in? Like 30 seconds if you can. Tom first, and then David. And then Emily, if you want to comment on those after.
Thanks for calling me out here. No, to be honest, no, I don't hear that kind of a conversation happening in military circles. Those are wider conversations about capitalism, neoliberalism, but the structure of our modern economies. That's not the kinds of conversations I'm hearing happening in forums. I hear a lot of conversations about how the military can reduce their emissions, what kind of, and very practical. That's a very practical, technical side question. And there's a lot of discussion about the implications of climate risks for military operations and procedures and plans. But I'll just reiterate something I mentioned in the chat, and that's that, I've been following these discussions and involved in this work since the 1990s, and people were worried about the military's role in environmental security back then. Military soldiers tend to be quite dissatisfied when they're called to do things that are not part of their core missions and roles. So, for instance, a lot of militaries have been called on to respond to disaster relief and assistance in the last few years, and it's been a tremendous burden on their operations. And many militaries are very unhappy with this. And there is a serious and interesting discussion going on about whether or not we could create non-military disaster response organizations in countries like Canada that would remove this as a military mission. And I think we need to support these kinds of non-military solutions. And that means, finding a way to deal with climate risks that doesn't involve investing in more military solutions.
Thanks for that. And David, if you'd like to make a brief comment.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks for the question. I'll deal first with indigeneity and decolonization. These are very much part of the mainstream conversation at the Military College, the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, and National Defence Headquarters. We have hired an academic, Danielle Lucier, to lead indigenization of the Academy. We have special programs for Indigenous youth and youth leadership. So the indigenization and decolonization, very much part of the mainstream conversation. Degrowth, a little bit less so. Supporting what Colin said, going back to the 1990s, Carlos Menem and the white helmets idea. Yes, there are a number of initiatives to develop the capacity for civilian response, but I think those are they require more social support than we see at the moment for this kind of activity, and it's far easier to simply task soldiers to do whatever society needs rather than to mobilize the social resources and the political capital to get people out of the the capitalist order and into community-based action that needs to happen. So I think that's something that there is room for civil-military cooperation on. In terms of degrowth and moving away from a neoliberal economy, an economy that is bad for the planet and bad for society, I think that will only happen when we exhaust all other alternatives. It's like democracy. Democracy is the worst thing going except for everything else. And that brings me to the final remark, which is that the military is a terrible organization that really should be disbanded, defunded, and got rid of until we realize that there are other actors out there that are worse than us and that are quite happy to take over parts of Ukraine and the Baltic states and so on. And frankly, I'm rather attached to the odd way that Canada does things, and I think that's worth protecting. So I'm not ready to get rid of the military yet. I am ready to reach out and try and bring your expertise into the military academy so that the next generation of young military leaders has a more nuanced understanding of the best way to achieve security. I think we can do that in Canada. I don't think they're ready to do it in the US. I'll stop there.
Thank you for those comments. Dr. Gilbert, do you have a response? If not, I do have a quick one.
Yeah, go for it, Ali.
Okay, well, just thinking
And call me Emily too, please, but go ahead.
Okay, all right, Emily. In the context of degrowth, I think demilitarization, and I'm sort of interpreting what Emily was saying, need not be the full disbandment of the military. Right now, the conversation is on decarbonization, but why not degrowth in the military? Why does it need to continue to grow? Why are we expanding the budget and the capacity consistently? It's true that we lack global trust and there are actors that are adversaries in a conflict sense, but do we need to grow? And could that be part of the conversation in terms of climate mitigation within the system that we currently have?
Quick answer. Sure. It's the kind of growth. And if we could shape the 2% towards white helmets, civil response, environmental management, community support, if we call that part of the 2%, that's the kind of growth I'd like to see. We don't have good tools to decide what kinds of military toys to stay away from. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Now, there's another perspective here brought to us by Javier Ardaleza, apologies if I'm mispronouncing. She states that imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, means war, especially in a multipolar world like now. Imperialist countries like US and China, for example, are looking for resources, especially from the global south, for their market economy, while dumping surplus capital and products to developing countries. It also includes geopolitical influences to their puppet governments, like, for example, the US pivot to Asia, because there is an increasing challenge posted by China to the United States, and also via the creation of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, bloc within the Belt and Road Initiative. On the other hand, the US created the Quad Security Alliance that includes the US, Australia, and Japan. Given this situation, do you think we can rely on the people's movement globally in addressing climate change? Why or why not? And I guess that's for you, Emily.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand how that relates to the people's movement, and why we wouldn't be able to rely on them because there are these other military and geopolitical alliances. So I was just looking over the question to see if I could miss something. So I'm taking it, and maybe this is me misunderstanding it. So Javier, if there's clarification, please let me know. But I'm taking it to understand like that there are these big military alliances, geopolitical alliances that are regional around the world that are coming to be formed. And given that, it's very hard to imagine a way that people's movements would be more effective. I think, is that what you're trying to ask, Javier?
Oh, right. Thank you, Dr. Gilbert, and thanks everyone for this meaningful conversation. Uh, what I'm saying is like my question is basically if we can rely on the people's movement in terms of addressing the climate change in general, because I'm from the Philippines and our being an international student, I just like I'm still connected with my country because the issue right now is basically, for example, the West Philippine Sea, and we're not looking forward that Taiwan issue where Pelosi visited September, and then there's a higher tension going on, and even the United States government accepted that it's not Russia, it's China in terms of their political and economic challenge right now. So yeah, that's what's going on uh, in Southeast Asia, for example. And 2 weeks ago, the Vice President Kamala Harris went to the Philippines. She visited the Philippines to encourage the current regime to open the 7 military bases, and one of that is really close to the West Philippine Sea, where the Philippine government won in the UNCLOS. For you, I don't know if you were, some of you are familiar about we won in the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, the 7 islands that rich in natural resources. There is an estimate 2.1 trillion not reserves of natural gas and oil. So that's what, and China built that into their military base. So the conflict is getting like uh, the tension is getting higher. And also, I agree with one of the participants that the re-education of uh, the the military in general to become more humane, because I can most of them the militaries are also human beings like us. They are came from the working class families, and only the billionaires who are the CEOs of Raytheon, Boeing, those big corporations are the one benefiting from war. So yeah, that's my question is like how does the do we rely on the people's movement rather than on the military itself to address climate change in general? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and reply to that and maybe pick up on a few earlier points. I mean, absolutely, I think we need to rely on the people's movement, but also the military, since we do have militaries. I'm not naive enough to think that we should in 2023 get rid of our military in a world that currently we live in and that everything will be hunky-dory. I'm not in any way trying to suggest that that's the way to go, but I think that often that kind of thinking as it's all or nothing, or we need to have a military because there's geopolitical tensions, reinforces some of the problems that I feel are there with the way that we have structured society. So the point that you made earlier, David, about the fact that, yeah, there are things about Canada that we want to protect. I mean, we probably have some things in common and some things in different that we would want to protect. But I think one of the things I would want to protect is that we don't have a hugely militarized society, and that we certainly, even compared to the United States, do not have the extent of militarism there. And so shoring up the military to try and address these other issues, to me, is actually not protecting what we have, but moving us closer to what I don't want. And so how do we address climate change? Get the militaries on board because they are responsible for so much of it, work with them, and yet at the same time, work to another agenda, which is let's have a 2030 goal like we have with climate change reduction emissions, and a 2050 goal where we demilitarize. It doesn't mean we necessarily have to get rid of the military, although in my ideal world, we wouldn't have them. But let's think about degrowth of the military within those timelines, working hand in hand with them at the same time, and also thinking about what a different future could be. That relies on the people's movement, Javier, as well as working with the institutions we currently have. We have to look around us. This is the world that we have constructed, for good or bad, and deal with what we have here while also imagining the future possibilities.
Right. There are a couple other comments that perhaps make a question of how closely one could work with the military. Peter Jones spoke about decolonization as the elephant in the room. Worldwide, the US, with its 850 plus bases located everywhere, these bases control and exploit the countries they are in. The environmental impact and emissions of these bases is massive. There's also the example of Diego Garcia, for example, who has not been able to achieve independence for a long time. And a lot of these places are subject to the worst effects of climate. And then similarly, a user named, what was it? 1.5 degrees of peace was saying that the military is incompatible with feminism. Do you think that is the case? And do you think there's a case to be made for reforming the military and perhaps having a different mandate on top that reorients its strategic integration into civil society where it could become a cooperative force? So that was like 3 things in one.
Yeah, and I think, again, I was looking at some of the comments and maybe I missed a couple of those points, but I heard the last point. I do think we can do better with the militaries that exist in terms of the ways that they are also kind of a little social ecosystem. I think there have been changes, particularly in Canada. I do think, however, that there are certain kinds of tensions that the militaries exacerbate, whether those are around gender issues, sexuality, race, that I don't think the military can solve them just as much as we can't solve them in wider society overnight anyway. I mean, I think we're working to those ends. So I do think that there's some restructuring that could be better and make the military a more congenial kind of organization. But again, if they're going to still insist that, their soldiers are there to fight and to defend, we're always going to have that perpetual challenge that was referred to earlier, that, even military soldiers themselves don't like having this, being tasked with the humanitarian kinds of efforts that they are asked to do now, because it does go counter to some of the other kinds of training that they have had. So they're being trained to do far too many things that most of us can't even, manage to look at the chat and keep in track of the conversation. And they're asked both to save people's lives and to kill others at the same time. And that's, save them in ways around climate change or whatever else they're doing. So those are challenges. With respect to the foreign influence around bases and so on, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the US counts as such a big military, is that it has this global expansion in terms of its presence around the world, and as was mentioned, in very volatile places that are subject to climate change. And I think, that I'm not here to change the US military. I feel like that's for the Americans to do, although I will keep making my points known. But I do think that that's part of the problem as well. That global reach is absolutely, I think, part of the problems that we face today. And even if it's not in itself as directly connected to climate change, is part of the problems that climate change is all about. And I mean, it is connected to climate change, but it's not the main contribution. But I think it speaks to the kinds of world that we have created that are just really problematic, which we are coming, to have to deal with today. And I'm sure I missed parts of that there too. So you could ask me again if I haven't covered them. Sorry, I keep being drawn to the chat and then I lose track of what's being said.
No worries, no worries.
All of you who weren't instructors in a classroom during COVID know what our challenges were as we were trying to navigate between these two things. Anyway, go.
There's one other topic that came up in the chat that I think is pretty interesting, which is Andre says, why not ask ourselves if GDP should be our main metric for success? Are there better metrics? And sort of following on to that, is there a place where you would advise activists or people who are volunteers or working full-time on climate-related issues to focus their attention on, to have the most impact, given this aspect of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, as I began by saying, I'm not, my work is not really all about climate change, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an activist who's been involved in climate issues. I mean, I've tried to do my own tiny little thing, but that's not been where my main investments have been. So I'm not really the person to try and figure out like what the best strategies are. I'm getting more invested and committed into these issues for personal and professional reasons. So I will be learning from all of you as we go. But yes, the question about GDP, I mean, I do think it's a horrific way to calculate economic strength. And I think that we're all chained to it now. It relies on growth. It's a competitive kind of model that demands, this constant, increase in our capacity, which then reflects our, all of our strength on the international scene as well as domestically. It takes no account of the distribution of wealth internally to a nation state, how people are able to live and their quality of life. So I do think it's highly problematic. I don't have any other models to hand that I would use otherwise, but the fact that we even need those models and rely on them as a kind of a litmus test for where a state is how it's doing, I think is hugely problematic. But I mean, these are all huge questions, right? And this is why we have these conversations, is to help us think differently and to open these opportunities. And I'm certainly not the person who comes with all the solutions to these problems, although I love having the opportunity to have this discussion.
Great. Richard, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask based on the discussion you've heard?
I just have one comment based on our discussion, which is a comment that's remark or perspective that I've felt very deeply lately, and that is basically this: that the military or person and the peace organization person talk past each other all the time. Each of them has a perspective that is rational within its own framework. So the military supporter or military person will say, of course, you've got to have national security. There's some very nasty people out there who have designs on the Arctic, other things. So of course we have to have a large military. And if the military also spends money on green technology, on lowering its carbon imprint, that's great. Then the peace organization person says, we are in the middle of the midst of an emergency. We only have a very limited time to actually save the world, to put it very dramatically, from a disastrous climate change. The fact is, the military is one of the major bases of the status quo, and it's the status quo that is actually killing us in terms of consumption, production, and the use of energy. So things have to change, and if the military is getting greener, that's all to the good, but the other problems that we've mentioned are still overwhelming. So the peace person has a vision of human security based on the individual rather than the nation state. And we proceed from that kind of vision. So the two groups are actually talking right past each other, and they'll probably continue to do so, unfortunately. That's all I have to say.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more audience question. If anyone wants to, I've exhausted the chat. If anyone wants to ask, maybe raise your hand in Zoom, and we'll take one more question before we wrap up. Oh, looks like everyone who wanted to ask something had their questions raised. Okay. Well, that was a really lively discussion covered a lot of ground. Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for joining and sharing your thoughtful contributions to the conversation. I learned a lot to think about as well in terms of strategy and tactics, in terms of how do we as a species overcome this climate crisis, because even though we've drawn these lines on the ground and we compete over resources, there's only one planet and we only have one shot at this. So thank you everyone. Emily, if you have some final words to say as well, please. If not, thanks.
I'd just like to say thanks to everyone. As you've just said, like, these are huge problems, and I don't think the solutions are easy, and I think we have to come to terms with that and do the best we can, which means working hard to trying to make change. But I think sometimes this idea that this whole system needs to change, which I believe it does, but it becomes overwhelming and can lead to inaction or fear of what to do. And I think we need to address these issues, talk about the complexities, deal with the fact that we might be working with people that we might disagree with on occasion or not always in agreement about what they're doing, and figure out ways to move forward. And I think, you know, that we have the capacity to do that. And I love the conversation for raising all great points that I will continue to think about myself as well.
Okay, with that, thank you, Emily. Thank you to the audience. I also want to call out Melissa. Thank you for setting up the meeting and making sure it ran smoothly. And Richard, thank you for making this happen. All right, good night, everyone.